The basis of the endocrine system are the endocrine cells, which release chemical signals called hormones into the body. You can divide these into three groups. There are the autocrine hormones, or just autocrines, which act on the same cell that secreted them. There are also paracrines, which act on nearby cells. And then there are the classical endocrine hormones, which actually enter the bloodstream and can act on any cell in the body that have the receptor for that hormone. A group of endocrine cells is called an endocrine gland. This is where you have to make a distinction between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete their products into the body, usually into the blood, whereas exocrine glands secrete their products into ducts, which can lead out of the body or into some large body cavity like the stomach. It's important to remember that all of the hormones from the endocrine system come from endocrine glands. Just like you can divide hormones into autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine, you can also divide them based on their chemical structure. The protein hormones, like insulin or growth hormone, dissolve in water. The steroid hormones, like testosterone or estrogen, dissolve in fat. And the amine hormones, which are made by modifying amino acids, can be in either group. Some are soluble in water, some are soluble in fat. So after a protein hormone has traveled through the bloodstream and has come into contact with its target cell, it's not actually going to enter that cell. It's going to bind to a cell surface receptor. These cell surface receptors have three different domains. There's the binding domain, where the hormone binds on the outside of the cell. There's the transmembrane domain, which is the bridge through the plasma membrane. And there's the cytoplasmic domain, inside of the cell. So when the hormone binds to the binding domain, it's going to change the conformation of the receptor so that the cytoplasmic domain changes. And that's going to send a message to the cell to change its activity. And this is how that hormone does its job of sending that message from the initial endocrine cell to the final target cell. Protein hormones need to use the cell surface receptor because they can't move through the plasma membrane. However, steroid hormones can dissolve in fat, so they can actually move directly through the cell membrane and enter the cytoplasm and bind the receptor there. The combination of the receptor and the hormone can then go inside the nucleus if it isn't there already, and act as a transcription factor to change how that cell is expressing its genes. Another nugget to point out about steroid hormones is that because they dissolve in fat, they can't dissolve in water. So when they travel through the blood, they usually need some kind of carrier molecule to get them from the endocrine cell to the target cell. But after they reach their target, they're able to diffuse right through that membrane. The amine hormones are the special groups. If they're water-soluble, they'll use a membrane-bound receptor. If they're lipid-soluble, they'll use an intracellular receptor just like the steroids. A key fact to point out here is that a hormone's activity is determined by the target cell. So different cells may be programmed to respond differently to the same hormone. Okay. If you're going to learn about the endocrine system, you've got to know about the master gland, the pituitary. This is a little jelly belly-sized pocket hanging from the bottom of the brain, and it's directly below a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is right here. The pituitary gland has two different lobes, the anterior, which means on your front, and the posterior at the back. It's really two glands in one. The posterior pituitary, also called the neurohypophysis, is literally just an extension of the neurons from the hypothalamus region of the brain. So the cell bodies of these neurons are considered the hypothalamus, and their axons, the ends of them, are considered to be the posterior pituitary. The hormones released here are actually synthesized in the cell bodies in the hypothalamus, but they get transferred down the neuron, where they're stored and released in the posterior pituitary. Two different hormones are released from here. The first is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which causes the kidneys to conserve water when you're dehydrated, and it's released when your blood pressure is too low or your blood is too salty, which are the symptoms of dehydration. A diuretic is something that makes you urinate, so when you're conserving water, that's called an antidiuretic, which is how this hormone is named. The second hormone released in the posterior pituitary is oxytocin, which stimulates uterine contractions when you're having a baby, and also stimulates milk flow during breastfeeding. In both sexes, it also promotes pair bonding. The second part of the pituitary gland is the anterior pituitary, the lobe at the front, whereas the posterior originates from neural tissue. The anterior pituitary originates from the epithelial cells of your upper mouth cavity. So these two parts of the same gland actually have completely different developmental origins. Like the posterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary, also called the adenohypophysis, is closely connected to the hypothalamus. And that's because the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary is directly controlled by hormones released by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases releasing hormones, which in turn tell the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. So the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus travel through portal blood vessels that connect the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and this will cause the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. So these releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are examples of tropic hormones, hormones that control other endocrine glands. So for instance, the releasing hormone TRH from the hypothalamus, which is thyrotropin releasing hormone, will travel through the portal blood vessels to the anterior pituitary, where it will stimulate the release of TSH, also called thyrotropin or thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyrotropin, it turns out, is also a tropic hormone. So the TSH goes on to another endocrine gland, the thyroid, to release TH, which is a hormone that stimulates your body to increase its metabolism. The pattern here is that the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus causes the release of another tropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, which goes on to another endocrine gland to cause the release of the hormone that has an effect. This is also true of CRH, stimulating the release of ACTH, which goes on to release cortisol, and the releasing hormone GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone, causes the release of LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary, which go on to release testosterone or estrogen or progesterone. It's important to get this pattern in your head. So the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of the second tropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, and finally the final hormone is released, in this case testosterone. Once you have this down, you can start to think about how is it controlled. This is done through negative feedback loops. The first type of negative feedback loop is called long loop negative feedback, and it's where the end hormone, in this case testosterone, inhibits the release of LH and GnRH, which causes the release of less testosterone and enables testosterone to be kept at a stable level. Long loop negative feedback occurs with all 4 traditional tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary: TSH, ACTH, LH, and FSH. Sometimes you can also have short loop negative feedback, which is where the anterior pituitary hormone feeds back to stop release of the releasing hormone. So far, we've only really talked about the 4 traditional tropic hormones released by the anterior pituitary, but there's also 2 other hormones released from here: growth hormone and prolactin. Growth hormone you've probably heard of before. It promotes growth in many tissues throughout the body. It also causes amino acid uptake by cells, which can contribute to building protein. Even though growth hormone isn't one of the 4 traditional tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary, it actually does have some tropic activity. Growth hormone stimulates the liver to make another hormone called IGF-1, which stands for insulin-like growth factor, which can go on to stimulate bone and cartilage growth. The last major hormone from the anterior pituitary is prolactin, which stimulates milk production. But if you remember, we already talked about a milk hormone, because there's oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, which stimulates milk flow. So what's the difference between oxytocin and prolactin? Well, prolactin causes milk production, but it doesn't actually release that milk. Oxytocin is what actually causes that milk to be released. So how I remember oxytocin is that baby giving a toast because it's drinking its milk. It's oxytocin. And you can remember prolactin because it causes milk production. The last thing I want to say about the anterior pituitary is a little mnemonic to help you remember all of these hormones. So remember felt peg. FSH, ACTH, LH, TSH, prolactin. The E stands for a minor hormone called endorphins, which has some pain-killing activity. And finally, the G is growth hormone. So use that if it helps you, forget it if not.